Is there a particular piece of code or feature you look back on now that gives you immense satisfaction that you've written in the past, in particular?
There's a couple of things that I'm proud of, although not necessarily because they were complicated. Like the one feature that I was most proud of for a long time was that I fixed Pinball. It's always Pinball. I fixed Pinball so it didn't consume 100% CPU. So
I wanted 1,000 frames per second.
Yeah, so it was often the case is like, oh, you kick off a build, you got some time to kill, I'll play a little pinball. When the build is done, then I can go and continue and do my development work. But the problem was that Pinball was written for Windows 95. It ran at 100%, it pegged a core, it ran 100% CPU because back in the day, like if you ran Windows 95 as fast as possible on the processors of the day, it could just about keep up its frame rate. But in the meantime, processors got faster and faster. And so I went to figure out like, okay, why is it taking so much CPU? And I realized that it had no frame rate limiter. It just rendered frames as fast as it could. And for fun, I found that there was some debug code to print the frame rate in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. So I turned it on, rebuilt it, ran it. It just showed asterisks. And that's because it only included a 2 or 3 digit field for the frame rate. But the actual frame rate, now the computers had gotten so much faster, was like, it was generating like 1 million frames a second. And so it clearly didn't fit. And my solution was, oh, I'll just add a frame rate limiter. I will just say, you know what? If you're at 100 frames a second, I think that's good enough. You can take a break. Take a break, come back when it's time for another frame in another 10 milliseconds. And once I added a frame rate limiter of 100 frames a second, the CPU usage just plummeted to like 1% or something. And so that for me, that was my proudest moment in Windows development was I fixed Pinball so you could kick off a build and play pinball at the same time. In terms of, now, mind you, that was not very technically difficult, but it gave me great satisfaction. Something that I am more proud of from a technical standpoint is that there's a debugger called the time travel debugger. This is a debugger that what you do is you run your program under the time travel debugger and it captures a trace of your program. So it records every single instruction that your program executes. If you execute a read instruction, it remembers what memory was read. If you execute a write instruction, it says, okay, good job. That's the memory that was written. And when it makes this recording of what your program did, you can then load the recording back into the debugger and replay it. And the great thing about this is since it is completely reproducing what happened last time, when you're doing normal debugging, sometimes you'll be like, okay, I'm going to set a breakpoint. You do some debugging. It's like, I messed up. What do? You have to start the program over, try to get back, get to the original conditions, set the breakpoint again, try to debug it again. And often, getting the program into the state where you want to debug it takes far more time than the actual debugging you want to do. But with time travel debugging, it's already recorded. So you can just say, go to time point so-and-so in the recording. And then you can just start your debugging from there. And if something went wrong, you're like, okay, it's a recording. So you can just say, execute backwards, go backwards in time, reverse, step backwards. And okay, I'm going to step forwards again and pay closer attention to something. So it's a really fantastic tool for debugging these types of problems where setting up the problem takes a really long time.
Right.
Often the problem might be like, I found a memory corruption. I found the code that's corrupting the memory. Who freed this pointer? And you can't set a breakpoint ahead of time. You don't even know where this breakpoint for the bad free is. But if you have a recording, you can go, hit the point where it's like, here's where we use the bad pointer. And then execute backwards to look to see who freed that pointer, right? So you have like the benefit of clairvoyance or hindsight, depending on how you're looking at it. Anyway, that's a very long setup for the fact that one of the things I worked with made some contributions to the time travel debugging code, and one of the things I did was in the code that does the replay is actually done by jitting the simulation, the simulated instructions that were previously executed. You can even make a recording on an ARM and replay it on an x64 machine, because we can replay ARM instructions. Like basically, there's like a tiny little ARM emulator inside the time travel debugger that's like single stepping in ARM, but it's really not single stepping in ARM. The great thing is time travel debugging is actually done in microcode. When you execute an ARM instruction, it actually breaks it down into like 3 little microcode instructions and records those microcode instructions. And so then the replay happens. And so I did a little work in the jitter that takes those microcode instructions and regenerates x64 code to execute those microcode instructions. And I wrote a couple of the jitters for some of the microcode instructions, but I also wrote the register allocator for the jitter, and I was very, very proud of that. So that was a very long story to say I wrote a register allocator for a jitter. I'm so happy.
I'd be happy too. Back in the olden days, one time, I colored compressed files blue and encrypted files green. I still argue that's a good idea when it's not the only indication. Of course, explain why it's actually a bad idea and what they're doing with it now, because I think they've taken that feature away.
Yeah, so there was a time when compressed files were blue. Was it compressed blue and encrypted green?
Yeah.
The problem with that, of course, is that there are people who have different types of color blindness, where those colors like are not distinguishable. And so this is one of the things you always have to pay attention to when you're doing user interface work that involves colors. You have to be conscious of the fact that there are people who have visual processing, or their problems with color processing in the eye. Either it doesn't pick up on it, or the brain has trouble processing the colors. And so you can't have color be the sole indicator of any particular piece of information. And so I actually don't know what we do now to indicate that a file is encrypted or compressed. I think we just don't indicate anything. But if you go to the properties, it'll be listed as whether it's compressed or encrypted. Fortunately, we don't have the problem of trying to show something in 2 colors at once, because a file cannot be both compressed and encrypted.
Right.
Otherwise, we would have to figure out how to do a checkerboard pattern.
Or aqua.
Or aqua.
Green and blue.
That's right. And now there's like, another category of color blindness can no longer use our product.